The herald's voice split the silence of 1,000 courts on the same night. Across the empire of Velkryth, in every city built from black marble and obsidian stone, the proclamation arrived the same way, carried on shadow wings, sealed in crimson wax, and delivered at the precise hour when the false moon hung directly overhead and the whole sky turned the color of a bruise. By decree of Lord Draevanor Thorneveil, sovereign of the Night Empire, blood master of the seven houses, eternal keeper of the obsidian throne, let it be known across every dominion, every city, every hall that bears our family, seal that a selection of brides shall commence on the next full rise of the second moon, noble daughters of good standing, age of eligibility, and verified bloodline shall present themselves at Thorneveil Palace no later than the 7th night following this proclamation. One shall be chosen, one shall become Lady of Thorneveil. Let none who receive this message mistake it for invitation. It is a command. In the parlors of great vampire houses, noblewomen read it twice and then immediately called for their dressmakers. In the modest, crumbling estate of House Kedron, a minor lordship so forgotten it barely appeared on imperial maps, the proclamation landed on a dining table, already set for supper. Lord Baven Kedron read it once, set it down beside his wine, and said nothing for a long time. His legitimate daughters, Sorith and Vane, were already squealing with excitement across the room, and in the servants' corridor that connected the kitchen to the east wing, a young woman carrying a pile of folded linen paused at the sound of their voices and pressed herself quietly against the wall. She always made herself smaller when they celebrated. It was safer that way. Her name was Velmyra, and nobody in that house thought of her at all. Velmyra had never been told directly that she was not wanted. It was communicated in other ways, in the way the kitchen staff received their wages on the 1st of each month, and she did not, in the way the seamstress was called every season to fit Sorith and Vane for new gowns, and Velmyra's dresses simply shrank as she grew, in the way Lord Baven used her name only when he needed something carried, something cleaned, or something too unpleasant for his real daughters to touch. Her mother, Lyretha, had been a concubine, a human woman, some said, though others insisted she had distant vampire blood, ancient and diluted and meaningless. Whatever she had been, she was dead now, had been dead for 11 years. From a fever that the house healer had not been called quickly enough to treat. Velmyra remembered her mother's hands, the way she braided hair, the low hum she made when she was thinking. She did not remember much else because grief, at age 9, had sealed certain rooms inside her and she had never found the keys again. She set the linen down on the shelf in the east wing corridor and returned to the dining room to clear the supper plates. You heard the proclamation, Sorith said without looking at her. Yes, my lady. Father says all noble daughters of eligible age must attend. Sorith's voice was the kind of sweet that had teeth underneath it. That includes you technically, since you do technically carry the Kedron name, regardless of how you came by it. Vane laughed into her wine. Lord Baven did not laugh. He stared at the table. We need to fill the required number, he said finally. Thorneveil demands 6 candidates per house if the house has daughters of age. We have 5. Velmyra is the 6th. Silence. She will go, he said. She will not speak unless spoken to. She will not embarrass this house, and she will come home quietly when she is dismissed, which will be within the first night. Velmyra stood very still, holding a stack of empty plates. Yes, my lord, she said, and she carried the plates to the kitchen, set them in the basin, and stood at the window for a long moment staring at the false moon, glowing white and cold above the cursed, silver-leafed forest at the edge of the estate. She did not cry. She had learned, a long time ago, that crying in this house only made things louder. Nothing could have prepared Velmyra for what Thorneveil looked like from the road. They arrived on the 7th night, traveling in a hired carriage that smelled of old wood and Sorith's perfume. The road approaching the palace rose sharply through a forest of silver trees That blood dark sap down their trunks like slow wounds. The mist moved between the trees with deliberate intention, coiling and uncoiling as if it breathed. Then the forest ended, and the palace was simply there. Velmyra pressed her face against the carriage window and forgot, for a moment, to be invisible. Thorneveil Obsidian Palace sat on a floating cliff, connected to the land below by a single long bridge of black stone wide enough for 4 carriages to pass abreast. Below the cliff nothing, an abyss so deep and dark it seemed less like a physical place and more like an idea. The palace rose from the cliff in a cascade of towers shaped like broken fangs, their spires disappearing into the low-hanging purple clouds. Every window was black crystal that caught the false moonlight and threw it back in shards. Blood-red runes glowed faintly along every wall, pulsing at irregular intervals like a heartbeat. It was the most beautiful and most terrifying thing she had ever seen. The carriage crossed the bridge slowly. Around them, other carriages from other houses were making the same journey, gleaming lacquered vehicles, decorated with house sigils, their occupants visible through jeweled curtains. Noblewomen in silk and velvet, their jewelry catching the light, their laughter audible even through the glass. Soreth and Vane were adjusting their hair and smoothing their gowns, faces sharp with focused ambition. Velmyra looked down at her own dress, plain linen, washed but not new. No jewelry. Her hair was clean but simply pinned. She had nothing to fix. "Stay behind us when we enter," Soreth said without turning around. "Far behind?" "Yes, my lady," Velmyra said. The carriage passed through the palace gates and stopped. The doors opened. The Empire's court poured out into the entrance courtyard in a glittering tide, and Velmyra stepped out last, into the cold, eternal violet night, and stood on the obsidian stone of a palace that did not know she existed. The entrance hall of Thorneveil Palace was built to make you feel small. Velmyra understood this immediately, the way she understood most things quietly, without announcing it to anyone. The ceiling vaulted, so high above that the floating candles drifting near its peak were the size of pinpoints. The floor was polished black obsidian, so reflective it gave the illusion of walking on still, dark water. Coffin-shaped pillars lined the hall, carved with centuries of names and blood runes, and between them stood palace guards in ceremonial black and silver armor, faces still as statues. The red carpet running down the hall's center shifted faintly as they walked across it, the enchanted velvet moving like liquid beneath their feet. Noble ladies flooded the space in extraordinary number, 43 women total. Velmyra would later learn, drawn from 12 great houses and several minor ones. They arrived in cascades of velvet and silk and lace, their perfumes competing sharply in the cold air. Ruby and sapphire jewelry flashed. Silver crown chains rested on elaborate hairstyles. More than one woman wore a gown that probably cost more than Lord Bavan Kedron's entire estate. In the center of this bright, cruel constellation, Lady Varelia Mordath moved like a woman who had already won. Velmyra noticed her the way you notice a fire, because not noticing it would be dangerous. Varelia was extraordinary, tall and perfectly proportioned, with porcelain skin, sharp cheekbones carved like architecture, deep burgundy hair pinned in a towering arrangement threaded with black diamonds. Her gown was midnight silk with a deep red corset bodice, the skirt trailing behind her like blood spreading across the floor. Her eyes were a sharp, cold violet. She did not look around the room so much as conduct it, as if the other women's presence was something she permitted. Varelia's gaze swept the entrance hall once. It landed on Velmyra for approximately 2 seconds. Then it moved on with the same disinterest one gives a piece of furniture. A woman beside Varelia, her attendant, by the look of her livery, leaned close and whispered something. Varelia's lips curved. "Ah," Varelia said, her voice carrying. "So they sent the rejected daughter too. I suppose even Thorneveil Palace needs someone to clean the floors." Several women nearby laughed, not cruelly enough to be reported, just enough to land. Velmyra looked at the floor. The red carpet shifted softly under her feet like something breathing. She kept walking. He did not come to greet them. Velmyra had known enough about power in its minor, household form to understand that the one who waits is always the one who owns the room. Lord Draevanor had never walked to meet anyone in his life. He waited in his chair and let others come to him. But Draevanor Thorneveil waited in ways that made the air feel different. They were assembled in the great throne hall on the second night of their arrival. After one full night had been spent in their assigned quarters, a time that served, Velmira suspected, to let the nervousness fully ferment. The hall was larger than some of the cities she had passed through on the road. The throne itself sat on a raised dais of black stone, flanked by twin columns etched with glowing amber runes, and it was carved from a single piece of obsidian into a shape that suggested a seat of authority, without quite looking comfortable, as if whoever sat there was never expected to rest. He entered from a side door. No herald announced him. He simply appeared, and the room went quiet, the way a forest goes quiet when something large moves through it. Draevanor Thorneveil was the kind of tall that restructured your understanding of the space he occupied. Broad-shouldered, precisely built, wearing a long black coat with a high collar embroidered in silver and dark gold, the coat falling to his knees over fitted black trousers and boots without ornament. His hair was black with threads of silver running through it, worn loose to his shoulders and pushed back from his face. His skin was marble pale and entirely motionless, the way old, cold things are still. His eyes, when they swept the assembled women, were amber gold, not warm amber, but gold the way a predator's eyes are gold, flat and calculating and very, very old. He looked at 43 women standing in formal presentation. His expression communicated nothing. He walked to the throne and sat with the ease of someone for whom the word commanding was invented, one arm resting on the side, and regarded them all with the patient, empty attention of something that had already outlived every expectation placed on it. "You have arrived," he said. His voice was low and even. It did not need to be loud. It moved through the hall the way cold air moves through an open window, quiet and everywhere at once. "The selection trials begin tomorrow night. You will be evaluated. Most of you will leave. One will remain." He paused. "Do not mistake my choosing you for sentiment. I require a wife for the Empire. If any of you came here believing otherwise, you have my permission to leave now." Nobody moved. His amber gold eyes moved slowly across the assembled faces. They passed over Velmira without pause. She had expected nothing else. She still felt it, somewhere very quiet inside her, the way you feel a door close even in a house full of noise. She stared at the glowing blood runes on the throne, dazed, and willed herself to remain perfectly still. The first trial was called the Trial of Blood Memory. Each candidate was brought before a palace archivist who held a silver basin filled with dark water. They were asked to press a single fingertip to the surface. The water responded to bloodline rising toward nobility, reacting to magical lineage, going still for the common born or the diluted. It was, in other words, a way of ranking them before the Lord had to waste time on them. Velmira waited at the end of the line. She watched each woman approach. Soreth's water rose in a modest arc, respectable, middle tier. Veins barely moved. Virelia's water didn't just rise. It surged upward in a perfect column and held there for 3 full seconds, before collapsing. And the assembled court murmured with impressed recognition. 3 other women produced strong reactions. Several produced almost nothing. One was politely escorted from the hall immediately. Then it was Velmira's turn. Archivist Saravan Ithres was a lean, ancient-looking man, though in Velkryth, ancient-looking and ancient were not always the same. He had pale gray skin, deep-set silver eyes behind thin-framed spectacles, and white hair swept back from a narrow, precise face. He held the basin with both hands and watched her approach with the careful attention of a man who had done this several thousand times and still paid attention to every single one. Velmira pressed her fingertip to the water. For one breath, nothing happened. Then the water moved, not upward, the way the others had gone. It moved sideways, rippling outward in slow, perfect rings, the way a stone drops into a still pond. The rings reached the edge of the basin and seemed to continue past it. running along the surface of the archivist's hands, along the stone floor. The air near the basin dropped several degrees. The floating candles overhead flickered in a direction that had no wind to explain it. Sir Raven Ithries went very still. He looked at the water. He looked at Velmyra. His expression, which had been the pleasant professional mask of someone performing a routine task, changed into something much quieter and much more careful. "Name," he said. "Velmyra, of House Kedron." He said nothing for a long moment. "You may step aside," he said finally, and his voice was entirely neutral, which was the kind of neutral that is working very hard. Velmyra stepped aside. She did not know what had happened. She only knew that the archivist was watching her for the rest of the trial with the focused, troubled attention of a man who had just found something in a place where it was not supposed to be. The palace's east residential wing had been divided among the candidates by status. Predictably, Lady Varelia Mordath occupied the finest Suite A, corner chamber overlooking the abyss with 4 tall black crystal windows and a private parlor decorated in deep red and obsidian. As if the room had been anticipating her specifically, her attendants set about arranging it with the efficiency of people who had done this in a dozen palaces before. Velmyra's room was at the end of the corridor, near the servants' stairwell, in a chamber small enough that the single window was more of a suggestion than a view. The bed was adequate. The writing desk was older than anything else in the room. There was no vanity. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. A soft knock came at the door. "Enter," she said, out of habit since in Lord Bevan's house. Not answering quickly had consequences. The door opened to reveal a young woman, carrying a tray with a small cup of dark liquid refreshment, and what appeared to be a folded linen cloth. She was slight, younger than Velmyra by a few years, with warm amber brown skin, close-cropped dark hair, and eyes that were an unusual deep gold, the kind of eyes that were common among the lower-ranked palace servant class, turned by ambient palace magic over years of proximity to noble blood. She wore the palace handmade uniform, deep gray with silver buttons, and moved with a quiet economy of motion. "I'm Elithra," she said. "I've been assigned to assist you while you're here." Velmyra looked at the tray. "They assigned you to me, not to one of the Kedron daughters?" "They assigned me to you," Elithra said simply. She set the tray on the writing desk and straightened. Her expression was composed and entirely without the small flickers of contempt Velmyra had already seen from most of the senior palace staff when they'd processed the candidates. "Is there anything you need tonight?" Velmyra thought about it. "No," she said. "Thank you." Elithra paused at the door. "The candidates are gathering in the east parlor in an hour. It's not required." She said it with the careful neutrality of someone offering information, not direction. After she left, Velmyra drank the dark liquid and stared at the ceiling. She went to the east parlor anyway, not because she expected anything good from it, but because her whole life had trained her to move toward places where she wasn't wanted rather than away from them. Running away had never been an option. You learned instead to endure. The parlor was full of sharp eyes and sharp tongues, and she said nothing and stood near the window and watched the false moon. And 2 women made jokes she was clearly meant to hear, and she heard them, and she stayed anyway, because leaving would have made her seem afraid. She was not afraid. She was tired, which was worse, but quieter. The second trial was called the Trial of Composure. Each candidate was brought individually into a small, perfectly dark antechamber and asked to sit at a low stone table across from Lord Draevanor himself. No attendants, no audience. 5 minutes of conversation that he controlled entirely. The candidates who went in came out looking variable degrees of disturbed. One emerged visibly shaken and walked immediately to her room. Varelia came out after 7 minutes longer than anyone else, a point she made sure the room understood, looking composed and faintly triumphant. "He spoke with me about governance," she announced to the assembled women. "He found my knowledge of the Eastern Territories impressive." When Soreth came out, she told Velmyra flatly not to speak about their house. When Velmyra's turn came, the palace attendant who escorted her to the chamber door gave her a look of mild pity and left. She entered. The room was exactly as described: dark, a small stone table, 2 chairs. A single floating candle hovered at the corner, burning very low. Draevanor sat opposite the empty chair, his long coat falling perfectly from his shoulders, his amber gold eyes giving off the only real light in the room. They moved to her when she entered. She sat down. Silence. Velmyra, he said. Not a question. He already knew her name then. She had not expected that. My lord, she said, of House Kedron, a minor house. Your lord holds what territory exactly? Approximately 300 acres in the eastern lower provinces, mostly forest and some grain fields, strategically valueless. Yes, she said. My lord, why are you here? She considered the question carefully. Not what are you doing here, but why, which was different, and which she thought deserved the honest answer. To complete the required number, she said, I am the 6th candidate of a house that only had 5 real daughters. I am here to fill a line on a list. He looked at her for a long moment. The candle flame did not move. That is the first honest answer I have heard in 3 days, he said. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. He studied her with those cold amber gold eyes for the remaining minutes, and she met his gaze because looking away would have felt like bleeding. And she was very good at not bleeding in front of people who might use it. He dismissed her without another word. She walked back into the corridor and stood, for a moment with her back against the wall, breathing slowly. The attendant was watching her with something that was no longer quite pity. By the morning of the 4th night, 12 women had been dismissed. Draevanor's method of elimination was unhurried and absolute. He did not announce it dramatically. Each dismissed candidate simply found a folded notice in their room when they woke, sealed in black wax, with 3 words written inside. You are released. No explanation, no appeal process. The remaining 31 gathered in the throne hall at the designated hour and tried not to look at the empty spaces where people had been. Aurelia looked at them. She made a point of counting the remaining women and allowing a small, satisfied calculation to move across her face. Lord Merov Duskharrow stood to the right of the throne, arms crossed at the chest. He was built like something that had never been hurt, badly enough to learn caution, broad, scarred, enormous in the specific way of someone who had been fighting longer than most people had been alive. His skin was deep brown with an almost metallic undertone common among the Duskharrow bloodline, his short-cropped black hair silver at the temples, and his dark eyes moved across the room like a perimeter sweep rather than an observation. He wore a general's formal black armor with gold and blood-red detailing and no expression that suggested he was enjoying any of this. When Draevanor entered and the room performed its customary wave of silence, Merov watched the assembled women with the frank, practical suspicion of a man who had spent centuries protecting an empire from people who smiled at the person they intended to betray. He suspects all of them, Elithra said quietly from beside Velmyra, close enough only for her to hear. Velmyra glanced at her. The handmaid's deep gold eyes were moving across the room with the same careful attention as Merov's, though considerably less visibly. He's right, Velmyra said. Elithra looked at her sideways. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. You're still here, she said. It was a quiet statement. I expect that to change tonight, Velmyra said. It did not change that night. When Velmyra returned to her small room after the assembly, there was no black sealed note on her pillow. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. He did not intend to notice her. It happened in the way that unwanted things tend to happen through accumulation. The first thing was the trial answer. To fill a line on a list, he had asked 43 women why they were here over the course of 3 nights, and 42 of them had given him some permutation of duty, honor, ambition, or the particularly galling variation of because I believe I can serve your empire well. One had said she found him fascinating, which he found so obtuse as to be almost amusing. Velmyra had said a true thing. He stored it in the part of his mind where anomalies went, which was a very organized part. The second thing was what he had been told by Saravan Ithres. The basin reacted to her, Saravan had said, in the particular voice he used when he was choosing each word with deliberate care, not the standard lineage response. It rippled outward. I've seen that reaction pattern in the old texts once. What lineage does it indicate? I need more time to be certain, Saravan had said, which meant he was already certain and was frightened of saying it too quickly. The third thing happened during the third trial, the trial of social conduct, which was simply a formal banquet where the candidates were observed, interacting with palace guests. In theory, it measured deportment, conversation, political intelligence. In practice, it was a chance for every noble in the court to get a look at the candidates and form opinions that would inevitably reach Draevanor's ear. He watched from the high table. Most of the women performed. Varelia performed exceptionally, managing 3 separate conversations, simultaneously deferring to the older nobles with calibrated precision, and inserting herself into the most politically significant cluster at the table. Within the first 10 minutes, Velmyra sat near the end of the table, which was where they'd placed her. She did not perform. She spoke when she was spoken to, which was almost never. But at some point during the banquet, the young serving boy refilling wine goblets along the end of the table knocked over a full decanter onto the tablecloth. The room's attention moved toward the noise. The boy froze, red-faced, terrified. 3 nobles began calling sharply for a senior servant. Velmyra picked up a linen napkin, calmly set it over the spill, and said something quiet to the boy that made him exhale and immediately start moving again. No fuss, no attention sought. She was talking to the older woman beside her again within 20 seconds, as if nothing had happened. Draevanor saw it. He filed it away. He told himself it meant nothing. Lady Varelia Mordath was not a woman who panicked. She was, however, a woman who paid very close attention, and in the 5 days since the selection began, she had been paying attention to the wrong person. She stood in her suite's private parlor in a dressing gown of deep crimson silk, her black diamond hair ornaments removed, burgundy hair down in careful waves. Her attendant, a sharp-eyed woman named Kritha, was organizing jewelry on a velvet tray and watching her lady's expression with the professional attention of someone used to reading weather systems. She's still here, Varelia said. Kritha knew who she meant without asking. Yes, my lady. He passed over 3 daughters of greater houses in last night's release. 2 women from House Valdrith, 1 from the Saravan line. He kept her. It may be coincidence. The selection is still large. Varelia picked up a ruby ring from the tray and turned it between her fingers. He looked at her during the banquet. Kritha paused. Many women were observed. He looked at her 3 times, Varelia said. Lord Draevanor Thorneveil, who has spent 2 centuries communicating entire military strategies through single facial expressions, looked at a servant girl in a linen dress 3 times in an evening. She set the ring down. That is not coincidence. That is information. She stood and moved to the window, looking out over the abyss at the false moon. Find out everything about her. Who her mother was, what blood she carries, why Saravan Ithres visited his private archives for 4 hours after the first trial and hasn't told anyone what he found. Kritha wrote nothing down. She never needed to. And if we find something useful? Varelia smiled. It was the smile of someone who did not need to raise her voice to make a threat effective. Then we use it, she said, gently at first, and then less gently, if gently fails. She looked back out at the glowing false moon. I was meant to be Lady of Thorneveil, she said. I have been meant to be Lady of Thorneveil for 12 years. I have prepared for it. I have built for it. I will not lose it to a woman who doesn't even own a decent pair of shoes. The ruby ring on the tray caught the moonlight and held it, deep red as old blood. On the 6th night, the remaining candidates were given an unstructured evening, no trial, no assembly. It was, the palace steward announced, a period of rest. Varelia organized a private gathering in her suite. Most of the remaining women attended. Velmyra went to the garden. The palace grounds included what the servants called the Night Garden, a stretch of cultivated landscape along the eastern cliff edge, enclosed by low obsidian walls, planted entirely with silver-leaf trees that bled dark sap, pale moonflowers, and trailing vines of deep black ivy. The false moonlight turned everything to shades of silver and soft shadow. The crimson veins, the faintly red rivers far below the cliff, were visible from the garden's edge as thin lines of dim glowing light in the abyss below. She walked the garden's path alone and let herself, for the first time in 6 days, be entirely quiet inside. There was a stone bench near the cliff's edge wall, overlooking the abyss. She sat on it. She had been sitting there for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard footsteps. She stood immediately, because sitting while a superior was standing in the same space was a rule that had been conditioned into her since childhood. Prince Calvor Thorneveil stopped a few feet away and looked at her with open, curious amusement. He was clearly Draevanor's brother. The structure of the face was similar, the same marble pale skin and sharp architecture, but where Draevanor carried himself like a closed fist, Calvor seemed assembled from a different material, lighter, angled differently, as if he decided at some point that being related to an emperor was a resource to enjoy rather than a weight to carry. He was shorter than Draevanor by perhaps 3 inches, with silver white hair worn loose to his jaw and eyes of an unusual deep violet gray that moved with quick, attentive humor. "You are the only one who came to the garden," he said. "Yes, my prince," she said. "You don't have to call me that." He sat down on the bench she just vacated with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to ask permission for a seat. "Calvor is fine, or nothing. Plenty of people prefer nothing, I've found." He looked out at the abyss. "Which house?" "Kedron, minor house, Eastern Province." His violet-gray eyes moved back to her with a kind of alert intelligence that was less visible under the casual affect. "You're the 6th candidate. The fill number." "Yes," she said. "And you're still here on night 6. He smiled. "That is either very good luck or very interesting blood." She said nothing. He studied her for a moment with that quick, amused attention. "My brother," he said, "hasn't looked at a woman with genuine attention in approximately 70 years. The last time he did, the situation ended badly and he spent a decade burning the evidence. I'm telling you this not as a warning, more as context." "I'm not sure why you tell me this at all," she said. He laughed, a real one, short and surprised. "Because everyone else in that palace is performing and you're not. And it's been so tedious that I've developed something approaching gratitude." He stood. "Enjoy the garden, Velmyra of House Kedron." He walked back up the path and was gone. She sat back down on the bench and looked out at the crimson veins glowing below in the dark. She did not know what to make of him. She suspected that was exactly how he preferred it. The final assembly was held on the 7th night. 22 women remained. The throne hall had been arranged for ceremony, additional torches burning blue-white in their brackets, the blood runes pulsing in complex patterns along the walls, and the court assembled in full formal attendance along the sides of the hall. It was the most people Velmyra had seen in one room since her arrival, and the collective weight of their attention pressed down on the space like a physical thing. The candidates stood in a single line across the hall's center carpet. Velmyra stood at the end of the line. She had put on her cleanest dress. Lord Draevanor entered. He walked the length of the line slowly. He did not speak. He stopped at irregular intervals and regarded each candidate for a moment before moving on. Some he passed immediately, some he held with his gaze for longer. Varelia he paused before for a full, counted breath, and something passed through the assembled court, a collective intake, because everyone understood what a pause meant. Varelia's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. Her cold violet eyes met his without flinching. He moved on. He walked the rest of the line. He reached the end. He stopped in front of Velmyra. She looked up at him. He was so tall that looking anywhere else would have meant staring at his chest, and met those cold amber gold eyes directly. Up close, they were more complex than they looked from a distance. Something old and very carefully controlled. She said nothing. She did not know what she could possibly say. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "This one." The hall went completely silent. Then it erupted, not in applause and shock, in the sharp, disbelieving murmur of 40 nobles who had watched a selection process carefully engineered for one outcome deliver an entirely different one. Thorelia's face performed an involuntary second of pure devastated fury before locking back into composed porcelain. Soreth made a sound that was not a word. Several nobles turned to each other with open-mouthed expressions. Velmyra stood in the center of it all and could not, for a moment, breathe. Draevanor had already turned away and was walking back to the throne. Lord Marov, beside the dais, was looking at Velmyra with an expression she couldn't read, not hostile, but locked and guarded, the way a door looks when it's closed but not bolted. Velmyra pressed her hands together quietly in front of her and kept them there so they would not shake. They were married on the following night. There was no celebration. Draevanor had specified a civil ceremony with no public banquet, just the binding rite, conducted by the palace's high ritualist before a small assembly of court witnesses. Velmyra wore a gown that the palace dressmakers had apparently assembled in a single, frantic day, midnight black silk, with a silver corset bodice, simple and structural, the most beautiful thing she had ever worn in her life, and the first thing that had been made for her body rather than someone else's. She stood beside a man who did not know her and repeated the ancient blood bonding words of the Empire's marriage rite, and at the moment of the blood exchange, a single cut on each wrist pressed together briefly. Draevanor looked at her for exactly 1 second, and then looked away. The high ritualist announced them bound. The witnesses applauded with the restrained courtesy of people performing a function they'd been instructed to perform. That night, Velmyra was escorted to the ladies' wing, a set of rooms she had never seen before, far larger than her candidate's chamber, with high ceilings and those tall black crystal windows and furnishings in silver black velvet that cost more than everything in Lord Bevan's house combined. The bed was a canopied structure of dark wood and deep midnight silk. The dressing room alone was larger than her previous room entirely. She stood in the center of it all. Elithra arrived behind her and began quietly opening trunks that had been delivered from somewhere, clothing apparently that had been made in advance for whoever won the selection. They were beautiful. They were hers now. "He won't come tonight," Elithra said, without Velmyra having asked. Velmyra said nothing. "He sleeps in the East Tower. He's never spent a night in the ladies' wing in 200 years. I thought you should know." "Thank you," Velmyra said. She sat down on the edge of the enormous midnight silk bed in the most opulent room she had ever occupied and tried to understand what her life had just become. She was Lady of Thorneveil. She had no allies. She had no power. She had no idea why she had been chosen. And the man who had chosen her had already retreated to the other side of the palace. She looked at the ceiling. Then she looked at Elithra. "Are you actually a handmaid?" she asked. Elithra looked at her for a long moment. Her deep gold eyes were very steady. "I'm whatever you need me to be," she said. It was not a denial. The court's first response to Velmyra was to ignore her. This was, in its way, crueler than hostility, because it required coordination. When she walked through the main halls, nobles found reasons to turn away, to speak to each other, to look past her. When she entered a room, conversations did not stop, they simply rerouted. When she sat at the high table for the first formal court dinner as Lady of Thorneveil, the women on either side of her managed to conduct full, lively conversations with the people on their opposite sides, without once turning toward her. She ate her meal and watched the hall. The servants were different. She noticed it within a few days. The kitchen staff who brought food to the ladies' wing actually made eye contact with her. The young cleaning staff who worked the corridor outside her rooms began offering small, careful acknowledgments, a nod, a quick smile that disappeared before it could be observed by anyone with authority. The guard outside her door, a solid, scarred man named Thorneveil, who had clearly spent decades developing a professional expressionlessness, began adding a short "my lady" to his acknowledgement that started as dutiful formality and gradually acquired some warmth. She asked Elithra about the kitchen inventory one morning, not because she needed to know but because she was curious, and Elithra told her. She asked because she wanted to understand the palace as a living thing, how it worked, who managed what, where the systems were. She remembered how her mother had done the same thing in Lord Bevan's household. Lyretha had known every servant's name, had known who was struggling, had known which cook was covering for a sick family member and quietly adjusted expectations accordingly. That is how you survive a house that doesn't want you, her mother had said once. You learn its bones. You make friends with the people who hold the walls up. By the third week of her marriage, the head cook was setting aside fresh moonflower pastries for her specifically. The head groundskeeper had started leaving sprigs of pale night blooms near the garden bench, where she sat in the evenings. 3 separate servants had come to Elithra, not to her directly, not yet with small requests. An unfair scheduling situation, a supervisor who had been taking wages, a young girl who'd been assigned duties that were physically beyond her. Velmyra handled each one quietly and without fuss, using the limited but real authority of her new title. Nobody in the noble court noticed, but Draevanor's spy network was, by its nature, everywhere. General Marov, Dusk Harrow, came to the ladies' wing unannounced on the 22nd day. He did not send word. He did not ask permission. This was, Velmyra suspected, a test of some kind. She was reading when Elithra appeared in the doorway and said, "The general is at the outer door. My lady, he says he has questions." Her tone communicated an entire paragraph of information in 7 words. "Show him in," Velmyra said. Marov filled doorframes. There was no other way to describe it. He was built at a scale that made architectural openings feel insufficient. He stopped inside the sitting room door and looked around the space with the frank, tactical attention of a man assessing a position, then looked at Velmyra sitting in the reading chair with a book. "You've been meeting privately with palace staff," he said. No preamble. "Yes," she said. "What were those meetings about?" "Scheduling inequities, a missing wage payment, a servant girl assigned to carry stone blocks." She looked at him evenly. "I am Lady of Thorneveil. Managing staff welfare is within my authority." Marov's dark eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you know about Lady Virelia Mordeth's movement through the palace?" The question landed at a different angle than the first ones. She recognized the technique, establish an expected line of questioning, then break it sideways to catch surprise reactions. "I know she hasn't left," Velmyra said. "She was invited to remain as a guest of the court. She's still here. She was in the East Library on the 17th night and again last night. She requested access to the historical marriage records." Marov was silent for a moment. "How do you know that?" "Because the archivist on night duty told the morning archivist, who told the kitchen liaison, who told the head cook, who told Elithra." She closed her book carefully. "The servants know everything that happens in this palace, General. They simply know not to tell the nobles." He looked at her for a long time. The expression that had been locked and guarded since the night of the choosing shifted. Fractionally not warm, nothing like that. Something harder. Something that looked like the beginning of reluctant recalibration. "Virelia is looking for grounds to contest the selection," he said finally. "Bloodline irregularity. She's arguing that you don't qualify as noble." "Do I?" Velmyra asked. "That's what I'm here to determine," he said. She met his eyes. "I don't know what I am," she said honestly, "but I know what I'm not. I'm not a threat to this empire. I'm not here to take anything that isn't freely given. And I'm not going to leave just because Virelia Mordeth would prefer it." Something moved in Marov's face. Not approval, but the precursor to it, which was worth more. The archivist's private study was buried in the lowest accessible level of the palace. where the stone was oldest and the blood runes, carved into the walls, were in a script so archaic most nobles couldn't read them at all. Thorneveil, Ithri sat surrounded by towers of manuscripts and unrolled parchment scrolls. 3 separate reference texts opened simultaneously across his narrow desk, and was deeply unhappy with what he was finding. Not unhappy because it was bad information, unhappy because it was very, very significant information, and significant things required decisions, and decisions had consequences. And Thorneveil had lived long enough to understand that consequences were largely irreversible. The basin reaction had been his first clue. The lateral ripple pattern outward, not upward, appeared in exactly 2 historical records he could find. Both were from the early imperial period, before the current vampire noble house system had solidified. Both referred to individuals from a bloodline so ancient it predated the founding of Velkryth itself. The first queens, the vampire queens who had created the empire before it was an empire, who had drawn the magical architecture of the land itself, who had created the false moon as a fixed star of power, who had established the blood rune system that every noble house still used. Most historians treated the first queens as foundational mythology. The bloodline was believed extinct. The last first queen had died or disappeared, which in the historical record often meant the same thing. Approximately 400 years ago, Thorneveil had now found evidence that suggested the bloodline had not disappeared. It had simply been hidden, in a concubine, in a minor house, in a girl that no one had ever thought to look at. He closed the manuscript and rubbed his eyes behind his spectacles. The power that came with first queen blood, if it awakened fully, was not merely rare. It was the single magical force in Velkryth capable of overriding a lord's authority entirely. It was, in the most technical sense, the power that had originally created the lordship system. It was older than Draevanor, it was older than the empire, and it was sleeping in a quiet young woman who had come here in a plain linen dress to fill a space on a list. Thorneveil picked up his quill and began writing a very careful, very private letter. The question was not whether to tell Draevanor. He had to tell Draevanor. The question was how much to say, and in what order, and whether to warn Velmyra first. He tapped the quill against his teeth. He decided to warn Velmyra first. Draevanor found her in the night garden again. He had walked the eastern cliff path because he walked it most nights, because it was the only part of the palace grounds where the cold off the abyss was sharp enough to make him feel things at a physical level instead of just an ambient one, and he had been doing it for decades without encountering anyone because the staff knew better, and the nobles didn't come out here. She was sitting on the stone bench. She heard him coming. She had good hearing, apparently, and stood and turned, which meant he had already committed to the path, and stopping would have been both impractical and, on some level, undignified. He kept walking to the bench and sat on it. She remained standing. "You don't have to stand," he said. She sat down at the opposite end of the bench, a careful distance. They looked at the crimson veins far below. He had not spoken with her since the brief civil ceremony. He had told himself this was because there was nothing necessary to say yet, which was true. He was also aware that it was because she was an anomaly, and anomalies required careful observation before direct engagement, and something in him had been less willing to observe carefully and more prone to simply noticing, and he had wanted more control over that before putting himself within range. "You're not afraid of the abyss," he said. "No, my lord. Most people won't sit near the edge." "I find heights clarifying," she said. "Everything that seemed complicated at ground level becomes simpler when you can see the whole of it at once." Silence. "Thorneveil came to see you," he said. It was not a question. "Yesterday," she said, "he told me what the blood trial showed." And she was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was measured but entirely honest, the same quality it had had in the dark antechamber. "I don't know what to do with that information. He told me what my blood might mean. He told me what powers might come. He said I might already be exhibiting small expressions of it without knowing. It doesn't feel like power. It just feels like me. He looked at her. Her profile in the false moonlight was very still, the long dark hair catching the silver-white light, and her gray eyes were fixed on the abyss below with the expression of someone who was genuinely sitting with a difficult question, rather than performing the sitting. First Queen blood does not produce power through force, he said. It emerges through presence, through who you are in the room. She turned to look at him. Is that why you chose me? He held her gaze for a moment. No, he said. I chose you before the archivist's report reached me. She looked back at the abyss. Then why? She asked, and her voice was quiet and real and entirely without the political performance that had saturated every other conversation he'd had in this palace in recent memory. He was silent for a long time. Because everyone else in that hall was performing, he said finally, and you were just standing there, and I have not seen that in a very long time. She said nothing. The false moon moved above them very slowly. He stayed on the bench for another hour. They spoke occasionally about small things, the garden, the cursed trees, what the rivers below actually were, and when he left, he was aware of something in his chest. That was not his usual cold equilibrium, but something more unsettled. He chose to categorize it, for now, as interest, just interest. The attempt was elegant, as Verelia's things always were. It arrived as a formal petition, submitted to the court steward on the 31st day of the marriage. Citing a historical precedent from 300 years prior, the petition argued that a marriage, contracted with a candidate of unverified, noble standing could be challenged within the first moon cycle if evidence of bloodline irregularity was produced. It cited the Kedron concubine record Valmira's mother, Lyretha, and argued that Lyretha's status as a human concubine, rather than a bonded noble blood wife, rendered Valmira technically outside the eligibility requirements for the selection. It was, from a strictly procedural standpoint, a credible challenge. 3 court nobles co-signed it. 2 were Verelia's longtime political allies. The third was Lord Baven Kedron, who had apparently calculated that supporting the challenge cost him less than protecting the daughter he'd sent here to stand at the back of a line. The petition reached Draevanor in the morning. Valmira learned of it from Elithra, who had learned of it from the court steward's assistant, who had the same small network of quiet friendships as every other palace servant. Valmira read the copy. Elithra brought her and felt something cold move through her, not shock, because she had been waiting for this, but the specific pain of watching her own father sign his name to a document whose purpose was her erasure. She set it down. What do you want to do? Elithra asked. Nothing precipitous, Valmira said. She thought for a moment. Send word to Sir Raven. Ask him if the first Queen blood documentation is ready. Elithra looked at her with those watchful gold eyes. Also, Valmira said, find out if any of the 3 co-signers have their own bloodline irregularities. In the historical record, houses this old always have something they'd prefer not examined. Elithra's expression shifted slightly. That is not nothing precipitous, she said. No, Valmira said. It's something measured. She stood and moved to the window. Verelia has 12 years of preparation and I have 31 days. I'm not going to win a war of resources, but I might win a war of information. She looked at the false moon. She assumed I was harmless. I intend to let her keep assuming that for exactly as long as it's useful. It happened during a formal court assembly. Draevanor was addressing the high nobles in the throne hall, a matter of territorial dispute in the northern provinces that required direct statements of his authority. The hall was full, the court present in force, the tension that accompanied all high-level imperial business hanging in the air like a weather system. Valmira was in attendance, as was protocol for the Lady of Thorneveil. She sat to the left of the throne, slightly set back. the position of consort in official capacity, which was simultaneously the most visible and least powerful seat in the room. Lady Varelia was present as a court guest. She stood with her allies on the right side of the hall, and her cold violet eyes had been moving between Velmyra and Draevanor all evening with the calculating patience of a woman, running every scenario simultaneously. The territorial dispute escalated. One noble Lord Hadrivan, a florid, aggressive man from the northern marches, began pushing at the edges of propriety, his tone sharpening toward something that was not quite accusation, but was building toward it. The ambient tension in the room climbed. Velmyra felt something change, not in the room, in herself. It was the only way she could describe it afterward, a change in herself, as if something that had been very quietly present for a long time had decided to stop being quiet. A warmth at the base of her sternum, a faint sensation of light, though her eyes showed nothing. The floating candles in the hall shifted their angle, all of them simultaneously, and the light in the room changed. The argument dropped in volume. Lord Hadrivan stopped mid-sentence. The entire hall went, not silent exactly, but calmer. The way a room feels after someone opens a window and lets in cold, clean air. The aggressive energy that had been building simply dissipated, as if absorbed. Draevanor turned to look at her. His amber gold eyes moved over her face with sharp, intent attention. "Did you do that?" he said, quietly enough for only her to hear. "I don't know," she said honestly. His eyes moved to where the candles had shifted, then back to her. Something moved through his expression, not surprise exactly, more like the confirmation of something already suspected, and the sensation of the ground shifting beneath a certainty he'd built over centuries. Varelia was watching from across the hall. Her cold violet eyes had narrowed. She had felt it too. He went to the eastern tower that night and stood at the window for a long time. It was not like him to need to stand at a window. He was not, generally, a person who required the physical assistance of architecture to think. He had lived long enough to have developed internal equilibrium that did not require environmental support. But the evening had produced something he did not have a clean category for. He had watched 43 women perform for him over the course of a selection process. He had been watching women and men and courts and empires perform for him for 200 years. He understood performance. He understood ambition. He understood the particular architecture of people who wanted things from him and were intelligent enough to dress the want in elegance. He did not understand Velmyra, not because she was opaque. The opposite, she was one of the most transparently sincere people he had encountered in a very long time, and sincerity in a palace was its own kind of disorientation. The way a light in a completely dark room is disorienting, not because of its nature but because of its contrast. She had not asked him for anything. She had not positioned herself. She had not lobbied for influence or pushed at the edges of her new authority or used the title he'd given her to secure alliances that would benefit her at his expense. She had spent 31 days being kind to servants, reading in the library, sitting in the garden, and asking the archivist intelligent questions about ancient history. And tonight, without apparently meaning to, she had quieted an entire room, not through force, through presence. It emerges through presence, he had told her, through who you are in the room. He had said it abstractly, because at that point it had been theoretical, a historical blood power classification, a fact about ancient lineage. He had not anticipated what it would actually feel like to be in the room when it happened, to turn and look at her and understand, with the particular clarity that came from centuries of recognizing power, that the quiet woman in the midnight blue gown beside him was not a political convenience or an anomaly to be studied. She was something genuinely extraordinary, and she had no idea. He stayed at the window for a long time. Then he walked to the writing desk and wrote a very brief note. "Tomorrow night, the East Library. I have questions." He sent it to the ladies' wing. He did not examine too closely why his handwriting on the note was slightly less precise than usual. The East Library was the old Wings collection, not the public reference section but the private archive of Thorneveil, lordship histories, stretching back to early Empire records. It smelled of old parchment and something else, something mineral and cold, that Velmyra had come to associate with very old magic. Draevanor was already there when she arrived. He stood at the long central table, with 2 manuscripts open in front of him, and a third to his right, and when she entered he looked up, which she noted because he was a man who did not, as a rule, look up when people entered rooms they came into his awareness. But he did not track them in the way that suggested he'd been watching for them. She sat across the table. "Tell me what you know about your mother," he said. She told him everything she knew, which was not much. Lyretha's name, her apparent origin in the Southern Territories, the fact that she'd arrived in Lord Bevan's house as a concubine when Velmyra was 2 years old, and the fever that had taken her when Velmyra was 9. Her coloring, he asked. White hair, pale gray eyes, like mine, very pale skin, even for this empire. The servants used to say she looked like moonlight. He was quiet, reading something in one of the manuscripts. Did anything strange happen near her? Water, lights, temperature changes? Velmyra thought about it seriously. The floating candles in her room always burned cooler than elsewhere. When she braided my hair and hummed, the room got quieter, a beat. I thought that was just what a mother's presence felt like. He looked up at her. It wasn't, he said. Or rather, it was, but it was also first queen blood in low expression. Ambient calm, environmental response. You've been doing it your whole life without knowing it. She met his eyes. What does it mean? She asked. It means, he said carefully, that you are not who anyone in this palace believes you to be, including the people who are currently attempting to remove you from it. Something shifted in his expression as he said it, a slight tightening, a compression of the jaw that she had learned over weeks of observation, meant something had moved through him that he was choosing not to name. I'm not going to let that happen, he said, and his voice was still even, still controlled, but something had entered it, a directness that was different from command, more like statement of personal intention. She looked at him across the table. Why? She asked. The same question she'd asked on the garden bench. Why did you choose me? Why does it matter? He held her gaze for a moment. Because I made a decision, he said, and I do not reverse decisions. It was not the whole truth. They both knew it, but it was the part of the truth he could reach yet. When the soft approach failed, Varelia moved to harder ground. The petition had been denied. Lord Draevanor had dismissed it in 3 words to the court steward, which the court steward had communicated to the petitioners, with the apologetic efficiency of a man who understood that his lord's 3 words were architecturally equivalent to a wall. So Varelia moved elsewhere. She had spent her 12 years of preparation building relationships, not friendships. Varelia did not believe in friendships as a concept, finding them structurally unreliable, but obligations, specifically the kind of obligations that accumulated when you knew things about people that they would prefer not become public knowledge. She had 3 such obligations still outstanding among the current court. She called them in. The first was a senior council lord whose son had been involved in a Southern Territories transaction that was, at minimum, ethically compromised and at worst something the imperial law would find interesting. The second was a house matriarch whose recorded bloodline contained exactly the kind of human concubine dilution that Varelia had just tried to use against Velmyra, a detail that made the petition's failure more personally galling, but which had been hidden under a forged marriage record for 2 generations. The third was a court administrator with access to sealed historical documents. The third was the useful one, because there was something in the sealed records that Varelia had found during her second visit to the East Library, 3 nights before Draevanor had been there himself, something that had been sealed not to protect an embarrassing truth but to protect a dangerous one, a record of the last First Queen's death, or rather the record of why the First Queen's death had been recorded. The truth was more complicated. The First Queen had not died. she had been hidden by the current Thorneveil bloodline's ancestor, because the power she carried had been considered too dangerous to exist alongside a consolidating empire. And if Valmira's blood truly carried that power, if it fully awakened, then by the terms of the ancient founding compact, the power superseded all established lordship, including Draevanor's. Varelia held this knowledge very carefully, like holding a blade by the flat edge. She did not want to use it publicly, not yet. She wanted to use it on Draevanor first. You have married something, she would tell him, that could end your empire entirely. And all it needs is the right push to wake up. She would see, then, whether his new interest in his quiet little wife survived the introduction of existential consequence. Varelia requested a private audience with Lord Draevanor. He granted it. He would have granted it to anyone. Refusing a private audience from a co-resident court guest was a minor breach of hospitality protocol, and Draevanor did not leave protocol openings in his own house. She came to his receiving chamber in the East Tower, dressed in deep crimson, hair immaculate, every aspect of her appearance calibrated for the specific combination of beauty and authority she had spent years developing. She was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. Draevanor had never denied this. He simply did not find it sufficient. She laid the document on his desk. She explained its contents with precise, measured language, making no threats, simply information. The founding compact, what First Queen blood meant in terms of political authority, the implications for his lordship if the power fully emerged in his consort. She watched his face. She had expected calculation, possibly alarm, the particular rerouting. That happened when a powerful person encountered new information that required strategic adjustment. His expression did not change. I know, he said. She paused. Sorvin's report was comprehensive, he said. I've known for 3 weeks. Varelia recalibrated visibly, which was rare for her. And you chose to keep her. I chose to keep my wife, yes, knowing that her blood, if fully awakened, could supersede my authority. Yes, his amber gold eyes were cold and entirely composed. The founding compact also specifies, he said, his voice even, that of First Queen, bloodholder who is bonded to an existing lord does not supersede the lordship. The power becomes complementary rather than competitive. The bond is specifically designed to prevent exactly what you're suggesting. We are married, he said. The bond is made. Varelia stood very still. You knew that provision and you chose her. Before the archivist confirmed her blood, she said. Why? He looked at her across the desk. Because the Empire needs something I cannot provide, he said. It needs someone people choose to follow, not someone they follow because they're afraid. His voice was quiet and completely certain. I have been afraid for 200 years, which is what I've been asking everyone else to be as well. And it has not made this empire healthy. It has made it very, very controlled. He picked up the document and handed it back to her. I think we're finished. Varelia took the document. She looked at him for one long moment. Then she walked out. In the corridor, she stopped. Her hand tightened on the document until the edges bent. She had underestimated the depth of it. She had thought it was fascination, novelty, the idle interest of a bored ancient man. It was not. She would need different tools. It was subtle, almost untraceable, a compound derived from shadow binding components, designed not to kill but to destabilize, specifically to disrupt the awakening of moon-based blood powers. Used in the right concentration, it wouldn't register as an attack. It would read as illness, a fever, a gradual decline, and the power that was beginning to emerge in Valmira would simply stop. It was slipped into the ladies' wing evening refreshment tray on the 58th night. Elithra intercepted it. She did not intercept it because she caught someone in the act. She intercepted it because she had spent 58 nights learning the movements of everything that came near Valmira's rooms, and on the 58th night the refreshment tray had been handled by someone in the palace kitchen who had never handled it before, and Elithra had the kind of observational architecture that did not miss things like that. She brought the tray to Velmyra with a small note attached. Do not drink the cup. I verified the source. I will tell you what I know. Velmyra read the note, looked at the cup, and set it aside. When Elithra came to her room that night, she told Velmyra everything, not just about the compound, about herself, about why she was here not as a handmaid randomly assigned, but as someone who had been watching the Kedron bloodline for 40 years on behalf of a small network of people who had spent generations preserving knowledge about the first queens. You knew before I arrived, Velmyra said. We suspected. The basin confirmed it. Who is we? Elithra's deep gold eyes were steady. People who believe that the Empire needs what your blood can do, she said, and who have been waiting a very long time for someone who wouldn't be destroyed by the weight of it. Velmyra was quiet for a long moment. Draevanor, she said. Does he need to know about this attempt? Yes, Elithra said. Tonight? Before morning, Elithra said. Velmyra stood. She picked up the cup carefully, wrapped the linen napkin around it to preserve the compound, and said, Then let's go. Draevanor received them in the East Tower at the second hour of night, when Velmyra walked in behind Elithra and set the wrapped cup on his desk without preface. His eyes moved from the cup to her face and stayed there. She told him everything: the compound, Elithra's network, the 40 years of watching the Kedron bloodline, the purpose behind it. She told him without performance, without softening the edges, including the parts that were unflattering to her, that she hadn't known, that she had been managed, even kindly, by people with an agenda she hadn't consented to. Elithra's network, he said, meant her no harm, Elithra said, and still does not. We wanted the bloodline protected and given the opportunity to emerge naturally. We did not try to accelerate it, manufacture it, or weaponize it. Draevanor looked at her for a long time. Then he turned to Velmyra. The compound, he said. Virelia. Most likely, Velmyra said, though I can't prove it yet. I can, Marov said from the doorway. They both turned. The general was standing. In the entrance apparently he had been summoned by one of Draevanor's attendants. The moment Velmyra had been seen, heading to the East Tower at the second hour, his dark eyes were on the wrapped cup with the expression of a man who had spent centuries identifying threats and was currently deeply unsatisfied with what he was identifying. The kitchen staff member who handled the tray, he said, I've had 3 people whose movements I watch under different pretenses. One of them received private payment from Lady Virelia's attendant. Krita 7 days ago, he looked at Velmyra. I'm sorry this went as far as it did. It was, she understood, an apology not just for the incident but for the full arc of his suspicion. You were protecting him, she said, meaning Draevanor. I understand that. Something shifted in Marov's scarred face. Not just recalibration this time. Actual respect. Draevanor stood. Virelia leaves the palace tonight, he said. His voice had dropped 1 register, not louder, but denser, the way rock becomes denser under pressure. She is removed from court. The petition is sealed and cannot be re-entered. Her house alliances lose their current privileges effective. Morning, he looked at Velmyra. Is there anything you want added? She thought about it. No, she said. Removal is enough. She was trying to protect what she believed was rightfully hers. I understand the feeling. The room was very quiet. Then Kelver's voice came from the doorway, where he had apparently arrived sometime during the Marov conversation, and was leaning against the frame, with his arms crossed and his violet-gray eyes moving between his brother and Velmyra with expression that was, for once, not performatively amused. You know, he said, when you chose her, I thought you'd made a strategic calculation. No one asked, and now? But he answered it anyway. I was wrong, he said simply. That's all. Lady Virelia Mordath left Thorneveil Palace before the false moon completed its descent. She did not make a scene. She packed her belongings with the help of her attendants in cold, efficient silence, and she walked through the palace's main entrance. She carried everything internally precisely where no one could touch it. The palace was lighter in the morning after she left. Nobles who had been performing their allegiances in careful triangulation began gradually to reorient. A few came to pay formal respects to the Lady of Thorneveil in the days that followed, which Velmyra received with the same quiet courtesy she gave everyone, and which seemed to unsettle them in ways she found mildly interesting. It was Torvin, the guard at her corridor, who said it most directly. "They thought you'd be easier to dismiss once Mordath was gone," he said. "Good," she said. "Yes," he said. "My lady." 3 nights after Virelia's departure, Draevanor walked to the night garden at the usual hour and found Velmyra already there on the bench, watching the crimson veins below. He sat beside her, not at the far end this time. Closer. She didn't move away. "The court is adjusting," he said. "I know. Marov wants to formalize your security detail. I know that too. I'd like to choose who's in it." He looked at her. Something that had been living in his eyes for weeks finally permitted itself to be visible. Of course, they sat in the silver-white moonlight, the false moon above, the abyss below, the silver-leafed cursed trees moving softly in a wind that smelled of old stone and night. "I wasn't afraid of you," she said after a while, not looking at him. "When you chose me, everyone kept asking if I was frightened." "Were you anything?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Surprised," she said. "And then something I don't have a good word for yet." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that feeling," he said, and his voice had, for the first time in the months she had known him. She turned to look at him. "I didn't choose you for strategy," he said. "I chose you because you looked at me like a person instead of a throne, and I had forgotten what that felt like, in which the false moon moved and the candles in the garden burned low. I'd prefer not to forget again." Velmyra Kedron, daughter of a forgotten concubine girl who had come to a selection to fill a line on a list, Lady of Thorneveil, carrier of a bloodline that predated the empire she was learning to inhabit, looked at the most feared man in Velkryth and felt the last closed room inside her find, quietly, its key. "Then don't," she said. Above them, the false moon burned white and enormous against the violet sky, and in the palace behind them, in the stone bones of Thorneveil, the blood runes along the walls pulsed, once in the color they only ever showed in the oldest historical records. Not amber, not red, but a soft, luminous silver, the color of something waking up, the color of a queen.
This is Elite Divide, where every love story begins at the divide. Don't forget to click the subscribe button.